Here are some of the theories and thoughts after watching episode 3 of Loki season 2. We are literally halfway there into the season, and this episode was just a marvel in itself. Please stick till the end of the video for all the major references and theories on what might be happening next. This episode is titled as 1893, being the year where most of the sequences take place on the branched timeline, in Illinois' Chicago, during the World's Fair. As many of you may already know, when Ravonna travels to 1868 through the time door, presumably right after this scene from season 1, where she arrives on the sacred timeline and hands over the TVA guidebook to a kid variant of He Who Remains, who later on becomes Victor Timely, in the next 25 years, by 1893. So, Renslayer delivering the guidebook to the young Victor Timely created a Nexus event, which led to a branched timeline, which was all part of the plan made by He Who Remains since the beginning, as he knew the end was near for him, and probably placed a young variant of himself on the sacred timeline for restoring the order of the TVA, which was disrupted by the chaos of his demise. Also, in a way, the guidebook for the young Candlemaker variant of He Who Remains may well be a canon event for him to become Victor Timely. Next, the scene cuts to the temporal loom station, where everyone is having a panic attack, as the branches General Doc's pruned are growing back, and OB exclaims that, without the temporal aura of He Who Remains, it is impossible to save the TVA, then follows up saying,
"We can't get in there and increase the diameter of the loom's intake ring enough to boost throughput and clear that notch of unrefined time."
So they just have to increase the diameter of the loom's intake ring for all those extra branches to fit in, which will boost throughput and clear the knot of unrefined time, and this might be where the throughput multiplier created by Victor Timely comes into the picture, where it may act as a stabilizer for the loom. But, I think, knowing Victor Timely's inventions till now, that throughput multiplier may still fail, as it may be a prototype, and lead to the destruction of the TVA through spaghettification, caused by the temporal radiation. Also, I really like this variant of He Who Remains. Jonathan Majors did a phenomenal job portraying Victor Timely, and I hope to see more of him in the rest of the saga, if they don't kill him off this season. Then Loki and Mobius travel to 1868, in search of Miss Minutes, who may have the ability to prevent the temporal meltdown, as she has the administrate access to the TVA. And in this scene Loki asks Mobius,
"Any major figure arises from here?"
while standing right at the window of the variant of a person, who is in fact the most prominent figure who ever rose and conquered all of time. After that, they travel to the branched timeline of 1893, to the Chicago World's Fair, which is an actual real-life thing that happened, where the world's first Ferris wheel was unveiled. And a really interesting choice of a Ferris wheel, as it also represents the never-ending loop of the sacred timeline, where everything is balanced and controlled by the center of its axis, and the same goes with the sacred timeline by He Who Remains, where he is at the center of the sacred timeline. They find the clue for tracking down Miss Minutes through the newspaper, where the scene cuts to the Chinese theater, as Mobius and Loki buy some Cracker Jack. Chinese theater may be a reference to Iron Man 3, which was where the extremist explosion took place. Where Happy almost died. After that, they stumble upon the diorama of Odin, Thor, and Balder the Brave, the half-brother of Thor, who was actually meant to be one of the members of the Illuminati, in Multiverse of Madness, where the role was rumored to be played by Daniel Craig, but for some reason it didn't work out, I guess. Next, they find the sign of Victor Timely's temporal marvels, and marvels, being a reference to the upcoming Marvels movie that releases right after the day Loki season 2 ends. Then, as theorized before, this episode was indeed a continuity of the Quantum Mania post-credits scene, where Victor Timely is introduced, and reveals the temporal loom that he made, through the TVA guidebook. And I really like the parallels between Victor Timely's presentation of the loom, and Howard Stark's presentation of the levitating car. From the first Captain America film, where Howard Stark is legitimately trying to showcase his work, whereas Victor Timely is also trying to showcase his invention, but at the end, it was just a confidence trick, played for the bidding of the machine. Of course Victor Timely is not entirely a confidence trickster, he just uses it as a method for funding his more important inventions. And during his presentation, he explains how time is the future of energy, which is exactly how the TVA functions. Where the temporal loom refines and weaves the timelines to produce energy for the TVA, and overloading it will only lead to devastating outcomes, which will be one of the future episodes of the TVA spaghettification. After that, Victor Timely is chased down by the bidder, only for Victor to trap them in an ongoing Ferris wheel. Just like He Who Remains did with the sacred timeline, where everything and everyone is trapped in a never-ending loop of time. Sylvie shows up out of nowhere, presumably tracking Renslayer through the advanced tempad of He Who Remains, and immediately sets on trying to kill Victor, where Loki tries to convince her, as his temporal aura is the only thing that can save the TVA. Then she blows both of them out of the carriage, where Miss Minutes turns into the ghost clock. After that, Victor takes Renslayer and Miss Minutes to his place, and as soon as he gives more attention to Ravana, Miss Minutes gets bothered by it. Also, I really like the dynamic between Renslayer and Victor, where it sort of reminded me of Doctor Strange's relationship with Christine, where he loves her in every universe.
I love you in every universe.
The same may be applied to Victor and Renslayer, where regardless of the variants, Kang loves Renslayer in every timeline.
Professor Renslayer, you are quite a marvel.
Then Ravana and Miss Minutes explain everything to Victor. Soon after that, they get chased down again, where they escape them eventually, and sail to Victor Timely's lab at Wisconsin, for acquiring his latest prototype. And during their time on the cruise ship, Victor finds out that Ravana and Miss Minutes were the ones who delivered him the book, and thanks them for doing so, as he likes to think it is a correspondence between him and Ouroboros. We actually get a look at his picture, and the throughput multiplier, that is intended to prevent the temporal meltdown. Victor Timely says how he is limited by the technology of his time.
I always knew my ideas were good. I just didn't have the technology to make them really work.
Obviously a reference to Iron Man 2, where Howard Stark meant the same thing.
I'm limited by the technology of my time.
Then Victor and Ravana start to get along, but right after she says, partnership, he loses interest for the moment, and drops her. Next Victor and Miss Minutes get to the lab, and this where things start to get quite strange, where Miss Minutes gets way too comfortable with Victor, and confesses her intentions towards him, and asks as to why He Who Remains never provided her a real body. And as any sensible person from the late 1800s would do, he shuts her down, only to find Renslayer with an early prototype of the pruning stick, the same time when Mobius and Loki arrive, and try to save Victor from her. That's when Mobius says,
You have lost your way.
which might be an X-Men reference, where losing their own way has always been a thing in the franchise, and Professor X quoted that.
Just because someone stumbles and loses their way doesn't mean they're lost forever.
Then Renslayer says,
Did you happen to notice? The second I left, everything crumbled.
Might be referring to the statue of He Who Remains, in the opening scene of Episode 1, where it started to crumble after getting hit, and also how the Citadel at the end of time has been crumbling. Soon after she proclaims that she is order, Sylvie steps in, and establishes herself as chaos, where again she is headed for Victor. Only this time, Victor pleads for his life, really convinces her, and she decides to spare him. That's when Victor says,
You don't know me. You don't know the heart I have beating in my chest.
which I think is a callback to what He Who Remains said in the ending of Season 1.
Not every version of me was so pure of heart.
Where not every version of him was so pure of heart. And this may be an indication that Victor Timely is actually the version who is pure of heart, unlike his other variants who want to wreak havoc. And the concept of the heart beating in his chest has always been around since the beginning of Iron Man, where the Tony Stark's storyline revolved around the functioning of his heart. From the Infinity Saga, all of this just seemed connected. Then Victor walks into the TVA, and Sylvie kicks Ravana into a time door. That leads to the Citadel at the end of time, and the decaying corpse of He Who Remains, where I think it was foreshadowed in the first episode, with the crumbling statue, representing how the corpse was decomposing and crumbling away. That's the entire episode, and I think that the next episode will obviously be focusing on using Victor's temporal aura for opening the blast doors of the loom, and trying to retrofit it through this thing OB made, and use the throughput multiplier made by Victor Timely for increasing the diameter of the intake ring, boosting the throughput, which will clear the knot of unrefined time, and save the TVA. But at some point, something is going to happen, where the TVA will get spaghettified due to the radiation of the meltdown, after everyone escapes it. I just want Victor Timely to be alright. He for real seemed like a genuinely pure-hearted version of He Who Remains, and I really liked his character so far. I also believe that Loki and team, along with Ouroboros, will be trying certain combinations of every possible outcome for saving the TVA until they find an optimal solution. These are some of the theories, thoughts, references, and a recap of Loki Season 2 Episode 3. If you are still here, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, really appreciate the support on the previous videos. It ain't much, but it's honest work.